video?
Have no idea. But I think I'm gonna get a new webcam. Actually, I probably need a new computer. I think this one came over on the Mayflower.
You know, I just have a camera because my computer doesn't have a camera on it. So I just have a separate one that plugs into a USB port.
That's what I'm thinking about getting.
Micro Center over there by that good Mexican restaurant.
I didn't hear that.
Micro Center is a good place to
Yeah.
get one.
Yeah, that's where I'm gonna head.
Yeah.
Dick, you know, Anna Bennett, who lives not too far from you, has the same
Yes.
problem. I wonder if it's a web problem.
No, I don't think so. I think it's an equipment problem on my end.
Web cameras aren't that expensive, so it's not outrageous if it's not a camera problem, maybe.
Right.
Because I also have to use headphones. My sound is terrible.
Well, if
so-
I got a new monitor that's bigger, and if I plug it in, then I don't get any sound even on either one. So
Huh.
I've got some work to do.
Have fun.
Oh yeah,
There's nothing more fun, is there?
No. Ick.
or frustrating.
Oh, God.
Okay, I'm gonna quit flashing here.
Okay.
Welcome, Paul. Welcome, Ann.
Hello.
Hi.
Debray?
Hi.
Suzanne,
Nice to meet you.
welcome, Jerry,
Thank you. Good to be here.
Debray, and Leslie, and Paul. Yay.
Thank you for the very many notes and the updates. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Aren't we glad we're virtual? We don't have to venture out in the snowy roads.
Yeah.
Oh, Gordy, I can't imagine. This is so much better than driving at night in the snow.
We could do that,
There's
Leslie, didn't we, Paul?
credit paper online.
Everybody,
Would you
and
love to bring it up to me?
I mean, I would prefer to be in person, meeting with all of you in person. But under the circumstances, this works okay. Especially people like having Jerry here, who's in Florida, and Gary in DC, and Gail. Where's Gail tonight?
I'm in Denver, but I prefer Jerry being in Denver also. He will be here in a couple of weeks. So we'll be sitting together for a class.
Nice.
It'll be fun.
Well, let's give it a minute. See the stragglers come in. I'm sorry I had to go through the second. I hope you all got the revision.
Yes.
I did.
Thank you.
And I hope you don't mind my, those are the St. Luke's, even our Rodef Shalom people know me. I like maps. I like images, graphics.
I'm a visual learner too.
As am I, Leslie, yes.
Breaks up all that text.
In person, we could have touched the real thing, right? You would have brought it to us.
All of that stuff. Yeah. I have it in my garage. Yeah. If I had it in my garage, I'd be in trouble. The Israeli Antiquities Authority would be after me.
Yeah, they sure would.
Well, let's get started. Tonight, we are looking at chapters 3 and 4 in our book, The Pharisees. And these two chapters have an archaeological focus, which appealed to me. I think most of you, maybe all of you, know that I'm a professional archaeologist. I worked for 40 plus years in the private consulting world and retired in 2021. But since 2012, I have been traveling to Israel, and I've been digging at two sites there in Israel, Tel Ashkelon and Tel Shimron. And it has really opened my eyes, broadened my understanding of archaeology, and certainly the archaeology of that region. And one of the areas that it has expanded my vision is in correlating the text with the archaeological portion, the material culture. Working in the United States, particularly with pre-contact groups, we don't have a written record. And so all we have is archaeology, so we can make up stuff and hope that it flies. Anyway, can't do that so much, but we don't make up stuff, of course. But before I dive into the two chapters, I wanted to explain or introduce the conjunction of the Bible and archaeology. And there is what I'm calling an interpretive spectrum. You have on one end of the spectrum, you have the biblical literalism, i.e. the Bible is inerrant. Everything that is written in the Bible is true. So the Exodus is true. Joshua's conquering of Canaan is true. David and Solomon are true because it's written there in the Bible. And that has been the belief for, well, centuries up until the 20th century. And archaeologists, many archaeologists, some of whom weren't even archaeologists, they were more theologians and seminarians and ministers, would go, and their attempts were to prove what you read in the narratives in the Bible. More recently, there have been arisen in different areas, particularly in Europe, of what is called a historical minimalism. In other words, the contents of the Bible are ideologically and theologically shaped to a point to extol, to support the notion of this ancient Israel, as it were, that in their view didn't exist. And in fact, the Bible was written in the 2nd century CE. The events that occurred were written in the 2nd century CE or BCE, excuse me, and they were done with a theological perspective. And some have even referred to the Bible as pious fiction. I don't think anybody here would regard the Bible as pious fiction. But archaeology has kind of fallen in between, as in the middle spectrum, is that archaeology can provide evidence for, or lack thereof, of what we read in the Bible. And what we see is an intersection of the texts and the artifacts. There are other texts besides the Bible that support some things that we read in the Bible, and these are called extra biblical texts, and they come from Mesopotamia, from Assyria, the ancient kingdoms of Assyria and Babylon, as well as Egypt, and they attest to things that we read about in the Bible. So there has been, as I say, extra biblical support. For instance, there is a stele or a statue or an inscription that was recovered at a site known as Dan, in which it refers to the house of David. And this is the first extra biblical evidence that, in fact, there was a David. So no one contests anymore that there wasn't a David. Now, whether his kingdom was as extensive as it is written in the Bible, that's a whole other issue. And so they help clarify or support the biblical text. And artifacts and other cultural materials that are recovered by archaeology can corroborate the text, but the text provide a voice. So there's an expression that archaeological materials are mute, not entirely so, but they don't speak, they don't have a voice, and the text can then provide that voice. And it's what There's a professor, he's known as William Deaver. He's emeritus professor at the University of Arizona, and he's written extensively on the biblical archaeology, and he's been one of the antagonists of these historical minimalists. He speaks about a convergences of the text and the archaeology, and when they converge, we have greater support for what we read in the Bible. And even divergences, where the archaeology diverges from the text, or the text diverges from the Bible or from the archaeology, is instructive in and of itself. If you're interested in William Deaver, Bill Deaver, I'd encourage you to, he's got some interesting books. One of them is very tantalizing. Did God have a wife? Archaeology and folk religion in ancient Israel. Another one, what did the biblical writers know, and when did they know it? What archaeology can tell us about the reality of ancient Israel? Very, very interesting books, and if you're so interested, I encourage you to look at them. So archaeology is...
Gordy, when he refers to God having a wife, does that mean Jesus had a wife?
No, he's talking about Yahweh, ancient Israel, and the Ashtart, the goddesses of the Canaanites, and how Yahweh developed over time, and this perception that the Canaanites and the early Israelites may have, at folk religion, have honored female goddesses, and that's where the term "did God have a wife" comes from. So archaeology is, as Deaver writes, and I believe, is a primary source for understanding biblical text, because number one, archaeological data compared to biblical texts are contemporary with the events that they reflect. That pottery that was made and then deposited in the ground is contemporary within a few years of what actually occurred. The text, however, may be decades or centuries after the events. Archaeological data are unedited. They're a direct witness, and they're frozen in place and in time until they are brought to light by archaeology. And finally, archaeological data provide an independent witness that is more varied and dynamic than the text. So one or the other, or each of them, conspire to help us understand better what the biblical narrative.
Gordy, I have a question.
Yep.
Those people who call themselves historical minimalists, what is the basis of their view? What is it that they think of that would tend to undercut your thesis that that there may be convergence and duplication of the material that helps to go ahead and know, in fact, that archaeology may in fact be an intermediary to help explain what the texts describe? How do the historical minimalists minimize that?
Well, Deaver refers to them as nihilists. They are, they have an agenda. They have a political agenda that's modern. In other words, they are looking at the Israelis as using that information and in a political sense, and they are denying the archaeology in the to the Palestinians. And so they are operating from a modern political viewpoint to deny, in a sense, Israel having an ancient history.
Oh,
Well, I'm taking a class now on the story of Russia and the history of Russia, which is a major undertaking. But one of the things that we spoke about today was this idea of a group of people that lived and migrated to what is called the Khazars or the Khazara, and that they lived in the plains, the eastern plains of Russia, and that there's a question about whether or not they migrated also into the area that became and separated and segregated themselves into Sephardim, who moved south into the southern area, and Ashkenazim, who moved into Poland and Lithuania, Eastern and Central Europe. And the argument that was made was there are many people who deny, in as far as supportive groups, that there was any ancestral connection between the tribes in Israel and what happened in Khazar and that area in central Russia. And so the question is, I didn't think of asking the question, but the question really is there some evidence archaeologically for the migration of societies within ancient Israel that would lend credence to this whole idea of a common ancestor that arose through central Russia? And I don't know the answer to that. Does archaeology have something to say to this particular issue?
Archaeology usually does, Paul, and go too far down that path. But I would mention perhaps the diaspora after the 70 CE destruction of Jerusalem.
You're breaking up, Gordy. I'm sorry.
Oh, the diaspora, after 70 CE, when the destruction of Jerusalem might account for some movements of Jewish people into other areas, perhaps what is now southern Russia. But archaeology can provide information when coupled with the text that may exist, can help us understand. That's kind of the point I'm making with our understanding what's happening. And we're moving now to the 1st century CE and the events that are occurring there, and whether or not, following up on our first couple sessions, Gary's last week, is who are the Pharisees and what are they? What's in the name, etc. So let's dive into that. So chapter 3 is purity concerns in common Judaism in light of our archaeology. It's written by Eric Myers, who's a professor at Duke University and been working in archaeologist working in Israel for several decades. But he writes that purity concerns, and it focuses on the concerns for ritual purity, increased during the late Second Temple to late Roman period. That is about 100 BCE to 200 CE. And
Gordy, we're losing you with your sound. You're in and out.
well, that's weird.
That was good, what you just said. Maybe you have to stay at that level.
Okay. I don't know what's going on.
Perfect right now.
Relating purity concerns to the Pharisees or any particular group is difficult. But one author that Eric Myers cites, James Strange, in his book, Archaeology and the Pharisees, written in 2007, argued that the Essenes at Qumran, and you understand where Qumran is, and by the way, on my little images here, I have a map showing you where Qumran is located. If you didn't know so already, it's at the northern end of the Dead Sea. It's a ruin, Qumran, Qumran. It is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were located, near there. The Essenes at Qumran and the Pharisees were the only groups.
Gordy, you're still breaking up. Sorry. I don't know what's happening.
I don't know what's going on.
When you're close like that, it's fine. It seems when you move away.
Yeah.
I can't do all of this.
Right.
Okay, I'll stop doing that. Okay.
See if that helps.
All right, thank you.
I don't know where the mic is on the computer, but wherever that is, you need to be close to it.
Okay, well, I haven't had this problem before. All right. So Strange says, Strange
We
argues that-
still can't hear you.
Maybe
Yes,
it's better
that's
when you're far away.
still an audio issue.
Now talk.
maybe I should write this out.
Perfect.
You're good there. Yeah.
I think farther away is better, maybe.
Strange argues that the Essenes at Qumran and the Pharisees were the only groups who were deeply concerned with matters of public purity during this period. Got it? Okay. Eric Myers believes, however, that purity practices were widespread in the 1st century CE and touched all groups, citing the concept of common Judaism, which was actually coined by a man named E.P. Sanders in his book, Judaism, Practice and Belief, 63 BCE to 66 CE, to describe the viewpoints and practices of the masses. And he describes it as follows. These people worked at their jobs, they believed the Bible, they carried out the small routines and celebrations of the religion, they prayed every day, thanked God for God's blessings, and on the Sabbath went to synagogue, asked teachers questions, and listened respectfully. Common Jews in the 1st century CE. Jewish followers of Jesus would fall into this category as Jews, as common folks, as I've used the phrase Joe Bag of Donuts. Therefore, the purity concerns may be associated with any number of different groups, including Essenes at Qumran, the Pharisees, pilgrims, commoners, and maybe even the Sadducees. So again, difficult to isolate those fingerprints, attributes of what the Pharisees from an archaeological perspective. But Myers looks at 6 elements, I guess the only phrase I can use, that are left an imprint in the material record that are recoverable by archaeology. And they include resurrection and the afterlife, and tombs and ossuaries. Do you all know what ossuaries are? They are bone boxes. And I have a picture of those, of one. It is a limestone box. It's big enough to hold the longest bone in the human body, which is the femur. And it's used for secondary burials. So the bodies, upon death, are put in tombs. And when the flesh and everything has gone, then the bones are gathered up and put into the boxes. And then these boxes are put back in the tombs. And it frees up room for future burials. And this indicates to some that is some belief in the afterlife, of which the Pharisees believed, contrary to the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in the afterlife and the resurrection, whereas, as we've learned, I think last week from Gary, that the Pharisees did. So is this an indicator of Pharisaic practices? There is an archaeologist, her name is Jody Magnus. She stated, however, there's no correlation between the relative wealth and status of the deceased and the ornamentation of the ossuary. Plain and uninscribed ossuaries have been found in tombs belonging to some of ancient Jerusalem's most prominent families, meaning that you cannot tell from the ossuaries whether or not the individual had any status in the society at that time or not. And the image that I included here is an interesting ossuary. It is inscribed on the side, Yaakov, son of Yosef, brother of Yeshua. It's referred to as the James ossuary. James being, or Jacob, being the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And if it were in fact authentic, it would be a pretty amazing find. However, at this time, the box itself is authentic, but the inscription is considered to be fake. So, but there is another ossuary that is inscribed with the name of Caiaphas, who was the priest that condemned Jesus at the time of his condemned Jesus. So anyway, the ossuaries are possibly, but according to Myers, not conclusive as to the existence of Pharisees. You also have the second point is ritual bathing in mixa or mixeo. And these, well, you, all of my Jewish friends, you know what mixeo are. And I include a photo of one of the mikveh at Qumran. And if you'll look at it, you can see that it's got dividers on this. It's got the steps leading down into the bath, meaning that the users can walk down one side, bathe, and then walk back up the other side. But you'll notice there's a big crack in the steps. And that was due to an earthquake in, I think, 30 BCE. And anyway, little side note, archaeology side note. But that's an example of a mikveh. But the Pharisees who are followers cannot be identified as the sole builders and users of these installations. They characterize common Judaism. There is chalk stone vessels as indicators of table fellowship. And chalkstone vessels, and I included a photo of these. These are made out of stone, chalk, similar to limestone, because they're pure. Ceramics are considered to be impure. And so these would be representative of individuals used in their use at table of concerns for purity. And so suggestions that they might be associated with when found in domiciles, residence, could be indicative of Pharisees. And James Strange again assumes that the Pharisees were the ones that used these chalkstone vessels. But these artifacts have been found in such diverse contexts and in so many places that such an assumption is unlikely. They could have been used by any common Torah observant Jews. What about synagogues? The synagogue has been a Pharisaic concern since its Second Temple origins as a purpose-built structure. However, claiming that those synagogues can be associated with the Pharisees through specific architectural linkages with the temple courts goes beyond all the available evidence that we have. And there is no inscription linking any of the synagogues to the Pharisees has been found. And I included some photos of two first century synagogues. One found at Magdala or Migdal. This is on the western shore of the Lake of Galilee, Lake Kinneret, near Tiberias. I've been there. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty interesting. It's got some incredible mosaic floors and mosaics. And you can see the arrangement with the benches around the area where the, I don't know what you'd want to call it, the teacher or the leader would stand. And a similar synagogue at Gamla, which is on the east side of the Jordan River, again dating to the 1st century CE. But they're very different from, the architecture is very different from what you see in the would have seen in the temple courts. Finally, we have the phylacteries, and I was just reading up on that this evening. I guess that's a Greek term for tefillin. Is that pronounced correctly? Which are the head tefillin and the arm tefillin for observant Jews. And in those boxes, leather boxes, are scrolls. And this may be finally a correspondence between Pharisees and with correspondence with the Pharisees. And they're in the Qumran caves, and I've listed them. I've given some rather cryptic nomenclature, HQPHYL1, and I'll explain those in a moment. There is one arm phylactery slip scroll and 3 head phylactery scrolls that are completely compatible with Pharisaic scribal norms. So they are considered to be Pharisaic in their origins. And interpretations that members of the Qumran sect came out of Jerusalem or other parts of Israel to Qumran. They isolated themselves from that larger community, and it expected at least some of the members who joined the sect brought with them the tefillin that they owned before acceptance into the community. And Meyer believes that these texts and the cases in which they're found are proto-rabbinic, and thus leaves open the possibility that they provide physical traces of the Pharisees. And I included a photo of one of these tefillin or phylacteries that was found at Qumran, and you can see the individual scrolls in there. They're tied up. And so Myers concludes that identifying the Pharisees as a small particular group within a complex society in 1st century CE Judea and Galilee is hard enough using textual sources. Seeking their physical traces in the material record is even more difficult. But the tefillin and the phylactery boxes containing written remains are probably as close as we can come to succeeding in the quest of identifying Pharisees in the archaeological record. As far as the other material remains are concerned, the mikveh, the chalk stone vessels, and the ossuaries, they are evidence of a practical common Judaism that involved daily purity practices. And these purity practices were far more widespread than what Strange had suggested, and many different Jews employed them in their daily lives. So, good place to stop. Thoughts, reflections, comments on chapter 3, Eric Myers?
So these phylacteries, or what we call tefillin, can the scrolls, do they have printing on the scrolls? Can they tell what was printed on the scrolls?
And they're in Hebrew, and they, as I said, subscribe to Pharisaic scribal norms. Now, what that is exactly, I don't know. That's what Myers asserts, is that they correspond to what a Pharisee might write on these.
I'm under the impression, but I'm subject to correction from my Jewish colleagues, that the scrolls in the phylacteries contain the Shema, the prayer from, the liturgy that contains 2 paragraphs from Deuteronomy and 1 from Numbers. And they start Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, which means, hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So it's a proclamation of the oneness of God.
Is there only a single scroll in modern tefillin?
Is there a single scroll?
What the Shema? That's it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I'm not an expert on this at all, Joe, but in that photo here, you can see 4 of those scrolls. Would they all be the Shema?
I do not know the answer to that question. I have tefillin, but I've never opened the boxes.
I'm assuming that the 4 scroll, each of the scrolls has something different written on them, which is how it has allowed experts to align them with the scribal norms of the Pharisees in this 1st century.
So I have a question or comment. One of the boxes is divided into 3 parts, modern day. And there are 3 paragraphs to the Shema, and there's 1 paragraph in each of the 3 parts. Isn't that right?
You know, I have a book on this, Leslie, and I'm going to go grab it.
Okay. And then the other box, I think, I'm not sure if it just has one scroll in it or if it also has 3, but I think one of the boxes has 3 is divided into 3 parts for those 3 different paragraphs of the Shema.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the head to fill in actually have 4 boxes.
Oh, okay.
It's
Just like the one in the picture, Gary.
just like the one in the picture.
Okay.
That's right. And but I am a little perplexed as to, you know, how anyone could conclude that there's a Pharisaic norm and we have no Pharisaic texts. Right. So it might be better to say that it's similar to the later rabbinic norm, and so perhaps as we found them in Qumran, rabbinic Judaism comes from the Essenes.
Well, and that's going to lead us into the 4th chapter. We'll dive into that in a moment. Is there any other comments or questions about chapter 3? And we'll come back after Joe finds all that good information. We'll come back to it. It'll be pertinent because we are going to now turn to Pharisaic halakha as emerging from 4QMMT. And you're thinking, what the heck is 4QMMT? And we'll go into that in a moment. This is written by Vared Noam, who's a professor at Tel Aviv University. And the reflections are on several of the scrolls from Qumran, which we just discussed where it's located. This was the caves in which, well, we'll get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Pesher Nahum scroll, these people walk about in deceit and falsehood. With their false teaching, their lying tongue, and deceitful lip, they lead many astray. Their kings, princes.
Sit back in your chair, Gordy. You have any light back there?
These people walk about in deceit and falsehood. With their false teaching, their lying tongue, and deceitful lip, they lead many astray. Their kings, princes, priests, and people, joined with the resident alien, cities and clans will perish by their counsel. Honored ones and rulers will fall on account of their insolent speech. This is writing from the Qumran community's perspective on some other group, presumably back in Jerusalem. When speaking of the image of the Pharisees that emerges from the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars usually refer to the depictions by the Yahad sect, and I think, Gary, you introduced the Yahad, that is the Qumran community, of the group entitled the Seekers After Smooth Things. What was the phrase you used last week? The something after smooth things, Gary?
That's the phrase, the seekers after smooth things.
Dorsha halakot, halalkot.
Yeah.
Or the Ephraim. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of 981 different manuscripts that were discovered in 1946 or 47 and 1956 from 11 caves near Qumran on the northern shore of the Dead Sea. Most are written in Hebrew, with some in Aramaic and Greek, and they date to the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. In fact, the community at Qumran was wiped out by the Romans, and I think it was 68 or 69 CE, while the Roman army was on its way down to Jerusalem. These scrolls include 40% of them are from the Hebrew scriptures, and I understand every scripture in the Hebrew Bible but Esther is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. 30% are texts not canonized in the Hebrew Bible, but our Christian Bibles are. And 30% are sectarian manuscripts, particular to that sectarian community at Qumran. And they shed light on the rules and beliefs of a particular group, sect, or groups in greater Judaism, including the Essenes and perhaps the Pharisees. Gary.
Here's a question, Gordy, Gary. Gary has a question.
I know, Gary.
Maybe he's gone. Who knows?
I'm sorry, I set up my video. Right, that according to Josephus, the Qumran community was actually wiped out by the Zealots / Sakari up on the Masada, not by the Romans.
Well, the community at Qumran was routed, and maybe they escaped to Masada, but the Zealots did go to Masada. They have archaeological evidence that there were Zealots at Masada.
Right.
But everything I've read, Gary, is that the community at Qumran, the Romans took over that site.
Yeah, maybe I've misread Josephus, but for me, they certainly may have taken over the site, but certainly the text in Josephus would seem to indicate that the destruction of the community is actually due to the Zealots of Masada, not the Romans.
Okay, well, fair enough. And in any case, they were destroyed at about this time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So other descriptions of the Pharisees are found in the writings of Josephus, as we've just been discussing, as well as the New Testament. And I have a quote in here from from Matthew. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. And I said, what in heaven's name is the Moses seat? Well, looking it up, and please help me if I get this wrong, but when teachers of the law and Pharisees interpreted and enforced the law, they were said to sit in Moses' seat, similar to a judge who rules from the bench. So, I don't know, the Pope, when he speaks from the chair, ex cathedra, speaks infallibly. So I don't know if that's similar when you speak from Moses' seat. Any comments from our Jewish friends? Okay. The sectarians of Qumran, in contrast to Josephus and Matthew, denounced the collective character of the Pharisees and also considered their teachings to be smooth things, their speech to be lying, and their halakhic guidance to be leading astray. So I had to look up halakhic, and it's relating to the halakha, collective body of Jewish religious laws derived from the written and the oral Torah. Is that correct? Vered Noam writes that to explore the emergence of the sectarian dispute and become acquainted with the Pharisees, we should pursue the halakhic path. Who were the Pharisees in terms of religious law and practice? How did the schism between them and other Jewish factions originate? How did their halakhic rather than political identity evolve? Were they conservatives or revolutionaries? Did they represent the development of an ancient ancestral tradition or carry the banner of rebellions and innovations? The sectarians described the birth of their movement, indicating that the founders discerned their iniquity and knew that they were guilty people, and they were as blind as those who groped for a way for 20 years. But God discovered their works, namely that they sought him wholeheartedly, and he raised up for them the teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. And the teacher of righteousness was considered to be the leader in the sectarian community at Qumran. And I'm assuming that was not a single individual, but maybe several individuals who had fulfilled that role in the community. And Noam says that the birth of the sect was a religious revolution, whereas the Pharisaic culture represented an ancient, ongoing tradition. But one should think of the Qumran revolution as a reform, emphasizing the return to the written text if I remember correctly, the Pharisees were more proponents of the oral text as opposed to the written text. And the sectarians disputed that and wanted to return to the written text, weren't getting any traction, and decided to go off into the desert. Leslie.
I was under the impression that the Pharisees were adherents of the oral law in addition to the written law, not to the exclusion of the written law. Am I misunderstanding that?
I don't think so. I think I was focusing more on that real split between the oral and written, but elements, but they were in dispute or in conflict with those who, the Pharisees apparently, who were more proponents of that oral law.
Yes, because there were some groups that, like the Sadducees, as you say, who rejected the oral law altogether and only were adherents of the written law.
Right. And remember from earlier classes, the Pharisees were the party of the people, whereas the Sadducees were the elites in that
Yes,
society.
yes.
Gordy,
Yes.
I did find information about what's in the tefillin boxes.
Please go.
So the Shema itself, one paragraph of the Shema, the first paragraph of the Shema is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. And it commands, first of all, us to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And then the last two sentences of that paragraph say, and that you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, which is the yad, or the hand tefillin, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. So that's mounted on your head, between your eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the doorposts of thy house. That's the mezuzot. So the reason why these, the tefillin and the mezuzot contain these verses is because these verses command that the words of the Shema be put on your doorposts and be put on both your arm and between your eyes. And so the same verses of the Shema are in all of those three places.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Joe. Are you muted, Paul?
He seems
Paul
to be muted.
disappeared. Oh, there he is.
He's here, but he's muted.
You're muted, Paul.
Can't hear you.
Unmute.
Well, it says he's unmuted, but he's not.
Oh, God.
Boy, this is weird. Paul,
Let's see, Paul, can you play with your mute a little bit more? I'm afraid to hit this for fear I'll
Maybe type it in the chat.
ask to unmute. Okay.
okay, well, while Paul's doing that, let me, and what Joe just said is interesting because we get back to that scroll 4QMMT, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. But in following this discovery, that scholars proposed that the sectarians.
Now you're muted now, Paul. There you go. Can we hear you?
No, we can't hear him.
Yeah, he comes in and out of muting, so.
Maybe his volume's down.
I heard him before, so. Our technology has been a dream tonight, hasn't it?
Well, let's go on, Paul. Maybe we can come back when figure out what's going on. But the sectarians of Qumran preferred the priestly ritual stance of Leviticus and Numbers, whereas the Pharisees identified with the more popular inclusive law of Deuteronomy. So that might, I don't know if that how that fits into what you were talking about, Joe, that the Shema was the verses from Deuteronomy, correct?
Well, there are two paragraphs from Deuteronomy and one from Numbers in the
Oh.
Shema.
Okay. Well, the two groups apparently differed in their elevation of scripture, focus on Leviticus, Numbers versus Deuteronomy. So coming back to 4QMMT. So 4QMMT is the scroll found in Cave 4 at Qumran, 4QXXX. The MMT signifies, and I hope I get this pronounced correctly, Niksat Ma'as Torah, Hebrew for some precepts of the Torah or some rulings pertaining to the Torah. And in my little visual aids, I did include photos of Cave 4, which is perhaps the most famous of the caves at Qumran. It's located directly across from Qumran. It had 90% of the scrolls found in the caves. 90% of the scrolls were found in Cave 4. And that one photo shows the interior of the cave, obviously cleaned out of all the information. And then the other photo there is fragments of that 4QMMT, or the halakhic letter. But, and they date this scroll to 152 to 150 BCE, which was a time when the Hasmoneans took over the high priesthood and began to follow temple practices as identified as Pharisaic by later sources. So it's taking place this scroll was written contemporaneously with the time when the Hasmoneans had become dominant, basically a Jewish state for about 100 years before the Romans took over. And the text in the 4QMMT is a challenge to the leaders of the Jerusalem temple regarding their understanding of the purity regulations identified as those of the Pharisees. So the individuals who had written the 4QMMT, presumed to be the sectarians, the Essenes at Qumran, were conflicting with those leaders of the Jerusalem temple, and presumed to be the Pharisees. And the text is described by some scholars as a letter written by a leader of the Qumran community, possibly even the teacher of righteousness, to the leader of its opponents, a high priest in Jerusalem. So this was a legal dispute among two sects, two parties, prominent in Israel at this time, starting in Jerusalem, and then I guess the one sect got fed up and retreated into the desert at Qumran. Because no Pharisaic document has survived other than perhaps Paul's letters, scholars have attempted to reconstruct Pharisaic legislation by comparing halakhic discussion in the scrolls and in rabbinic literature, seen as a successor of Second Temple Pharisaic legislation. But there are age differences between those scrolls of at least 200 years, between the rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, which was written in 200 CE, the Jerusalem Talmud, 450 CE, and the Babylonian Talmud in 600 CE, leads the author to two conclusions. The rabbinic system reflects the Pharisaic forerunner, that is, it represents a common Jewish proto-rabbinic system of halakha, or the differences are attributable to the centuries between the two bodies of work, and the Pharisaic counterpart then remain unknown. So it's a linear development over time, the rabbinic manuscripts. But the 4Q MMT provides a laboratory for examining this issue. Each discrepancy between its sectarian legislation and the rabbinic framework represents an actual second temple controversy rather than a linear development. That is, 4Q MMT criticizes actual contemporary practices, most probably the Pharisees, in this particular scholar's viewpoint. So in conclusion, 4Q MMT shows that the Pharisees, not the sectarians, ushered in a halakhic revolution. The sectarians wanted to go back to the more traditional, fundamental tradition, and the Pharisees were not, and hence the dispute. And the sect escaped into the desert, only later to be eliminated at some point or another by either the Romans or the Zealots. All clear as mud, eh? Renee?
Mike, you have a short in your mic, Gordy, because sometimes your voice is bubbly.
Sorry, can't do anything about it, Renee. So just moving on.
All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I had to do what some people do, which is to go out and sign back in. My point medically was that the head tefillin actually goes a little bit higher than the top of the forehead. It really goes to what we see in newborns and in the first year of life as the anterior fontanelle, which is that space between the skull bones, in the skull, as though that's the direct lineage or direct line from the scrolls to the brain. And so there's a sort of a logic to the placement of the head tefillin that is supposed to go ahead and lead directly to what it is that we are supposed to incorporate into our brain or soul by what is written in the scrolls of the Shema. And so it's just interesting, I think, to me, as to where the placement is and what its logic is.
Thank
But
you.
the placement is on the forehead. The thing that's open is on top of the head.
No, that's the posterior, that's the back. The posterior fontanelle is where you're pointing to, Anne. The anterior fontanelle is right above the forehead.
Yeah, but you don't put, that's not where, you put it even lower. Oh, okay.
I know, and the placement is incorrect. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, I didn't know. I'm reform. I don't know anything about it.
That's okay.
Seriously.
That's
Seriously.
okay, but that's
I mean,
what
I do know what it's for, but I didn't know exactly where it should be. I didn't know that. Okay. All right. Thank you. That's interesting.
What
thing I learned, Paul, about that is that the arm tefillin goes on the non-dominant arm. Is that correct?
Yes,
that's where I put it. That's
except
The right
for
hand goes on the left.
except for left-handed people who go ahead and put the tefillin on the other side, on their right forearm, the non-dominant hand for lefties.
That would be me.
Is that okay to do either hand?
yes, because the Torah doesn't say, it simply says that you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand. It doesn't say which hand.
Oh, so that doesn't matter.
It doesn't say the right hand.
And there's no oral law about that. Nothing has come down about it,
No, there is rabbinic tradition, interpretation, and that's where Gordy, that's where you're sort of have led us this evening, which is what is the proper oral law and who believes it? And Rabbinic Judaism took off from that. But the question is, who was the predecessor of Rabbinic Judaism? And I think the archaeological evidence is unclear. That's where I hope you sort of were leading us.
I think so, and it kind of fits in with what Gary talked about last week. Is that there's still a lot of we don't know for certain. We still haven't solved the issue of who in fact are the Pharisees, and I don't know whether we ever will in studying this book. Maybe Sandy will get into it next week, or
Yeah, I've got the answer to that, of course.
okay.
I think Gail had a comment. Gail?
I did, I did want to, sorry, I did want to say for the people who have not been to Israel or the Holy Land, and if you are going, it's pretty amazing. You can see those Dead Sea Scrolls, not all of them, but the ones that are on display behind glass, and they look pretty good. And it's just amazing how old they are and how good they look.
The shrine of the book, and what you actually see is not the real things. They're downstairs.
Oh, really?
Those are reproductions. Yeah.
Because didn't we have a display here in Denver of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because I went to that.
Yeah.
We did too.
But those aren't
was-
the originals?
My understanding is that what you see, I don't know what was here in Denver, but what you see at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, what you actually see, those are reproductions. The real scrolls are safely stored away in the building.
It was at the Museum of Nature and Science.
Right, right.
Those were
But
reproductions.
the originals would just disintegrate, wouldn't they, if they weren't stored properly?
Correct. They are stored correctly, and that's why they don't put them on public display.
But before they were found, which was in the 1940s, right?
50s.
50?
Oh, 1947, they were found by Bedouins.
That was the year I was born, 1947. But
Auspicious, Joe.
what?
Auspicious.
Yeah, but I think that they survived
Yes.
from the first century CE until 1947 without being properly stored. And that's what is so amazing. And it's a function of the extremely dry climate near the Dead Sea, in a cave. So that's what's so remarkable about them.
And if they were stored in Jerusalem, they'd fall apart because it's a more humid climate in Jerusalem than in the desert.
It's closer to the Mediterranean, yeah.
What's
And higher
amazing to
elevation.
me about Qumran is I think about this shepherd boy that was going after a lost sheep, which is a is a wonderful story that comes out of the Holy Land. And he went down into that cave, and you take a look at Qumran, how that shepherd boy got down into that cave safely from just walking along that ledge and then coming down into the cave. I just find it's a parable in itself.
Is that who found the Dead Sea Scrolls?
It was a Bedouin boy running the sheep. He supposedly threw a rock into one of the caves and heard some ceramics breaking and went up to find. One of the boys ran away thinking there was a genie. The other one went up there. Frankly, I think they both knew that there was antiquities there, and they were looking for antiquities to sell. Anyway, we're at 8:01. Sandy, any thoughts looking ahead to next week?
Oh help on Josephus. And I may call Gary, but I'm also just doing a good Wikipedia study. So anyway, it's very long too. I'm doing both Paul and Josephus, and I'm hoping you all will read Josephus, and so I can concentrate more on Paul, because there's a lot on both of them. And they're, of course, they're out of 2 out of 3, they are the two that are the best sources that we have. So,
Yes.
and the other is rabbinic writings. So I hope we get into the rabbinic writings at a certain point too. Really would be interested in that.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you.
Good night.
Good job, Gordy.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
good job.
Yeah, nice job. Thank you very much.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Gordy.
You bet.
Difficult subject.
Thank you.
I mean, it's great.